I know we recorded an episode not too long ago. I think that doesn't matter because so much has changed in the last month, and I think there's a lot to talk about.
Sure.
And I think, this speaks to the moment. We're both stuck indoors, in a way, dealing with an ongoing issue, and it's going to be with us for at least a few weeks, probably months ahead. Maybe just, quickly ask you, in your own personal world right now, how are you dealing with this, just in a personal way?
Honestly, I have to say, I think I'm incredibly lucky because I can do most of what I do remotely. And now my big problem is a time issue because I have a full-time job. My wife has a full-time job, and we have these two kids who are quite young, 2 and 5. And so it's a matter of balancing full-time work and full-time childcare in a home and trying to avoid going out, except into the woods or something. Now, there are large numbers of people who've lost their jobs, who can't pay their rent, who don't have health insurance, who may be unemployed, who face a very precarious and bleak future, and I don't. So I feel extremely fortunate in that regard. Yeah. It's an interesting. For me, there's also a little bit of deja vu about the early days of the Lebanese war in the 70s, where it was kind of like, okay, now we can't go out. When can we go out? We don't know, and you can only go here and you can only go there. And you could do what you want, but it's a risk. And so every time you leave the house, not every day, but there are times when leaving the house is a risky thing to do. And, I haven't been through that since the 70s and 80s. And there is some deja vu about that.
Of course. And it's sort of a generational shift. You're reminded of the early years of the Civil War.
I am.
I keep going back to two events. The July 2006 war, obviously minus the bombardment.
Yes.
Very, very important. This is not a violent warlike situation.
No one's getting blown up. That's right.
No one's getting blown up, but this kind of stuck inside feeling. And the other one is the May 2008 battles, and primarily in Hamra and western part of the city in Beirut.
Sure. Yep.
And that kind of lockdown. The one thing I have never experienced myself is that we're all in this together.
Yes.
So you don't really need to have experienced this to explain it later. We're all experiencing it. Right. And that, I think, is quite interesting because you can talk to somebody across the ocean and they're dealing with it too. And you see sort of like it's a shared moment in history that I've never felt before.
The only big division at least in the United States, is the political division over the president, and his conduct, and that there is a major divide on that. But socially, at a human level, I think there is, generally speaking, a willingness to cooperate. Yeah.
Absolutely.
A shared experience.
Shared experience. And I actually deliberately did not send you sort of a structure to this episode. I wanted to keep it as loose as possible because I think it's important to maybe let the coronavirus feed into the topic whenever possible. But also there are things happening in the background, and they're happening, I think, in a way the coronavirus has kind of shelved those issues from news sort of daily grind. One clear example is that it was just almost like a bleep that Bernie Sanders today withdrew his candidate. It almost seemed like a very diminished moment in history.
I actually think it's a very big deal, because if he had insisted on continuing to contest the nomination, he's suspended his campaign. He's going to still try to get as many delegates as he can to increase his leverage at the convention, which is perfectly reasonable. But if he had continued to kind of challenge Biden as the presumptive nominee, the Democratic field would be much messier than it's going to be. In other words, he could have dragged this out in a way that was potentially costly, and he has chosen not to do that, and he deserves a lot of credit for not doing it. He's clearly avoiding any aspect of a spoiler role of anything remotely approaching kind of the Ralph Nader, sort of spoiler thing. And I think he deserves credit for that. So I think it's very important, actually.
Important, and also, as soon as it sort of has its moment, the coronavirus is back on the news. So it's,
right.
I think this would have been the big story.
One thing about it, Trump reacted very angrily on Twitter. He had 2 tweets right away in which he was screaming about Elizabeth Warren denying him the nomination, and had she only gotten out, he would have won on Super Tuesday, and all kind of other nonsense.
Yeah.
And it's really obvious that he is disappointed and frightened by this. And he wanted to run against Sanders. It's going to be very difficult to call Biden a socialist because it's ridiculous. And then secondly, yeah, exactly. But in addition to which, it's going to be particularly difficult when the Trump administration is going to be leading an effort to pump trillions of dollars into the economy, in a very New Deal, Keynesian, stimulus, disaster relief way.
Yes.
And you can't do that and then call somebody else a socialist, especially not when it has all the features of crony capitalism. I mean, where you'll be picking winners, and where he's going to try, having gotten rid of the inspector general, he's going to try to pick winners and losers. He's going to try, as with coronavirus relief equipment and PPE and ventilators, he's going to channel it, as much as possible to his friends, reward his friends, punish his enemies, this kind of stuff that he does in a very sort of systematic way. At that point, you're really talking about kind of a very advanced level of crony capitalism under the veneer of some kind of collective thing. It's going to be very hard to call anybody else a socialist under those circumstances, let alone Joe Biden. And that's just not going to work.
But that I like that you chose crony capitalism, because that in a way exposes 2 things that are happening simultaneously. The first is that there is an authoritarian trend that is absolutely, it's a byproduct of the pandemic.
Yes.
And we're seeing shades of it in Europe. Hungary is the most obvious recent example, which is a very frightening, it's a very disappointing and frightening development for Hungary.
It's shocking. Absolutely shocking.
You're seeing shades of it here, which examples that you just gave as well in the U.S.
And Israel.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
Netanyahu has used this pandemic to stay out of jail, stay in power. He's maneuvered himself into this situation where he's not even being indicted. He was going to be indicted, and on Wednesday, and on Sunday he closed the courts, and then never to reopen. It's remarkable. Orban in Hungary has created the first full-blown fascist dictatorship in the EU. And the EU has nothing to say about it. And it's really remarkable. Hungarian democracy is simply suspended. And here, I think it's very clear that Trump is the main thing. There are 2 things. One is there's this purge going on of layers of accountability, particularly inspectors general, who are being removed, and other people who are being removed. This purge of people within the executive branch who are there to hold him accountable and to watch over what he does. And he's not, getting rid of them. Then the other thing is this dry run that's just happened in Wisconsin, where there's an effort by the Republicans in Wisconsin to use the pandemic to try to suppress the vote sufficiently to ensure that they win. Because what we have in this country is a very strange situation of protracted minority rule. There are, by every count, considerably more Democrats than Republicans. But between the federal system and the Electoral College, which apportions votes for president in a very weird way, gerrymandering, other forms of voter suppression, and the fact that Republicans, while there are many fewer of them, they are much more committed, and they're very good at mobilizing their base, making everything a national election. Every local election is a national election, and every national election is about these issues that have nothing to do with presidential power, like abortion and marriage and education, which none of which have anything to do with the presidency, right? But it gets people to the polls. So they localize in national elections and nationalize local elections and drive people in fear of their identity to the polls. And they're very good about getting their people out. So what I think comes down to at this point, in a very funny way, is that whenever Democrats are either angered and afraid enough or inspired, as they were twice with Obama, to come out in big numbers, they win. But when they hold back, like the two midterms under Obama, where he wasn't on the ballot, they stayed home, then the Democrats lost twice. Or with Hillary Clinton, who did not inspire a lot of Democrats at all. And there was a great ambivalence about her. And so between these weird anti-democratic structures, some of which are historic, some of which are created, and the question of turnout, you get this minority rule thing. I think the Republicans know very well that for Trump to continue in office, they're going to have a low turnout. They cannot afford. If it's a high turnout election, they lose. This is as simple as that. And I think they are starting, and you see this in Wisconsin, starting to think that the virus, for all the harm it's going to do to Trump, and it is going to do a lot of harm to him, yet it could be used to create so much chaos in the election and suppress turnout to the point. This is the idea, I think. If it's not plan A, it's certainly plan B. And Wisconsin was a very obvious dry run. And the trump card that they have is the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court is clearly going to agree to everything that the Republican Party wants. These 5 people are not proper jurists. They are hacks, in my opinion, very partisan. And I don't buy the idea that this was an honest philosophical, that it was a narrow technical issue. It was not, in my view. And also the idea that this is just the natural product of different judicial philosophies is also wrong. I think it's all outcome driven, in fact. And this goes back to Bush v. Gore, where Democrats took a Republican position, Republicans took a Democratic position because they were interested in the outcome. So I'm not,
but there's
not
also
impressed.
Something quite interesting. Both Biden and Bernie were criticizing the primary process in Wisconsin.
Yeah, well, especially Bernie. Biden was ambivalent in the end, and he said it should be left to the state. Bernie was very against the vote going ahead. I mean, I think he thought that he needed more time, maybe that he could benefit from a little more time. And I think you can see that he must know. I mean, the reason that he pulled out today is he's seen the exit polls, internal exit polls in his campaign, and he's I've just been hit another defeat. There's no point. Biden adopted the don't vote thing kind of late, but he finally come to it. Yeah.
And so that there you have the shades of crony capitalism, at least America's experience with it, which is, of course, relative compared to what the Middle East has been going through. And we saw, I mean, an unfortunate hiatus with what we were both witnessing the past 5-6 months. And our last episode is what we were talking about, that sort of political and economic revolt. And that's been really put on hold. Just in sort of
less in Iraq, by the way. The Iraqi Shia youth are still, I mean, it's greatly reduced, but it's not sort of indefinitely suspended like in Lebanon. They're still on the streets. They're still mad. I'm not saying the Lebanese aren't mad. I'm sure they are mad, but it's sort of interesting. There've always been people used to conflate the two too much, and it's interesting that in Iraq there are still protests, no matter what.
It is remarkable. Actually, if anything, the Iraqis have been paying a much higher price than any. I mean, it's a very incredible sort of
They've
push.
given hundreds of lives now, the protesters. They've been shot, down. The leaders targeted specifically, snipers getting them one by one. The logistic networks for support targeted by the Hashd Sha'bi groups and others. It's pretty gruesome.
But looking at it from the States, sort of the acknowledgement that at least for good reasons, for the right reasons, the momentum has diminished. This is purely out of, I mean, saving lives. There's no way to keep doing this at the moment.
Of course, it's only rational.
Sure. And I've asked this question in different ways to different guests, and I just wanted to maybe gauge your mind on this. Do you think this pandemic is a potential fatal blow to this round of momentum? And that maybe weeks from now, even though the grievances are still felt, and you said it a moment ago that even if they've gone home, they're still angry. It doesn't matter whether they're on the streets or at home. The demands have been left unmet. Is there a chance that you will see the authoritarian aspect and maybe this sort of gradual giving up for the moment, only purely because the stakes are, it's just very difficult. Yeah,
I understand exactly what you're asking me. It's the right question, but I think the answer is I never believed that the protests as such, as they're structured now, and so sort of in the moment, were going to lead to a solution or a major change that would improve things for reasons we talked about in our last discussion. And I always thought that they would become ultimately exhausted or in some other way just simply worn down, that the blob, the kind of corrupt, political, in many ways confessional or sectarian, identitarian blob would manage to absorb the blows, and that it would survive that moment. But that doesn't mean that they were pointless or that they lose in the long run. Let me explain for a second. But because of that, because I always expected the blob to prevail in the short and maybe even the early medium term, because of the huge advantages the blob has, I don't think this is sort of a negative outcome in the sense that I don't think another 5 months or 4 months of protests would have produced a breakthrough in terms of what the protesters were looking for. I doubt it. I mean, they could have sharpened their demands, started talking about the Constitution, started talking about splitting Parliament into the lower house and the upper house, chipping away at the confessional system, getting more direct democracy with proportional representation, and really kind of empowering the voters as citizens rather than as clumps of identity groups or something like that.
Yeah,
this would have been great, but it's a tall order. Now, what I think and what I said last time is that the real impact, the prospect that this thawra, if you want to put it that way, which I think is a perfectly good way of putting it, has to revive Lebanon and restructure the country is essentially cultural and attitudinal and long-term. And as I said, I think it revives the idea of Lebanon as a modern national project that transcends subnational identities, confessional, sectarian, even maybe in some cases ethnic, these little subnational identities of which Lebanon, the national pact, pieced together.
Yes.
And I think, as I said to you in our last conversation, that idea, which was around in the 40s and the 50s and the 60s, and just it was presumed by most people, me included, to have died in the 70s and the 80s and the 90s and the noughts, and that it was just dead and buried. And obviously it isn't. And people from all walks of society and from every part of the country really do suddenly apparently believe in this. And that the fact that ideal has traction and can push back in a brave, principled, constructive, passionate way against the narrow little interests of these parochial leaders and zaim and warlords and feudal bosses and landlords and whoever the hell they are, people with money or guns or both, that In the long run, that can transform the country because it can create a different narrative. And then the narrative can develop over time and create political structures that are not protests, ad hoc protests, but that are actually, sort of political entities with leaders and accountability and mechanisms to get people elected and to make demands that are not, stop stealing or all go away, but to say, no, Article 26 of the Constitution, Article 82 of the Constitution, whatever it is. I may even have misremembered those numbers, but the point is that there are these agreements, and ultimately the really important thing also is completing the Taif process, which is kind of unfulfilled, at least in terms of getting rid of some of the outstanding militia groups like Hezbollah's independent militia, and all of that needs to be done. So you need a political movement to do it, and it wouldn't. I never expected this. My attitude from the beginning is this thing is great, but it's not going to succeed. And when it survived and continued over months, I said, wait, I'm wrong. Actually, it can succeed, but it can succeed in the long run by creating a cultural shift, an attitudinal shift, a new sensibility, a new narrative about Lebanon that is, e pluribus unum, transcendent, etc. So I think that's still possible. I think that's entirely still on the table, whether people are on the streets or not. That point I think has been made.
So I like that. In other words, the coronavirus, in a way, is irrelevant because that change takes time regardless.
Yes,
and whether or not the world is on hold for a few months, it's irrelevant. This process is a very long and difficult. There's something there that means. Yeah, exactly. But the hard work hasn't started yet.
I agree. That's exactly the argument I'm making. And what I'm sort of saying is that this is inspirational and crucial and kind of magnificent, precisely because it's the unanticipated resurrection of the noble part of the Lebanese national project. There's the quotidian part about all these little communities surviving without killing each other, literally killing each other, in a kind of loose competition, cooperation, whatever. And that's been there, since the war ended, since 1990, right, with the breaks. But generally speaking, that part of that idea of Lebanon is something that kind of sort of works, and people can kind of sort of live, and and it's okay, it's like.
It's always kind of, sort of,
a good place to live just because the Lebanese are great and Lebanon is great, but the country doesn't really function. But the point, I mean, it doesn't. But the point is, there's this noble transcendent vision which was there from the beginning, and we now know it's not dead at all, and that's an amazing thing to discover. That is a really inspiring thing to discover. And clearly this is a generation, and not just one, but a couple of generations, right? This is a Lebanese population, significant enough numbers of which, I would say clearly a majority of which yearns for that.
Yes.
Boy, you can work with that over time. Don't tell me that's irrelevant. When the majority wants something more in a aspirational way for the whole country, for everybody, against the elites, against people who steal, against people who, throw their weight around and have their narrow little agendas, or the agendas of very, think of tiny communities as opposed to everybody else. No, there's a whole other way of thinking about the country, and it's not dead. It's not in suspended animation. It lives. It's alive. It's vital. Absolutely. It gets people are willing to risk their lives, their freedom. They're willing. I mean, there was no guarantee that people weren't going to get shot. There was at some point, there was violence on those streets, especially when the Hezbollah and Amal guys started coming out on their motorcycles. And then there was always the chance of the army at some point, and that was no joke, that's not something you just do. And you certainly don't do it for weeks and months on end if you don't passionately believe in it. And it starts off with the stop stealing stuff, but it quickly becomes a coherent narrative about we're living in one country, but we want another country that we all kind of imagine as a different way, and it's rooted in history. It's rooted in the national narrative and the national experience in a very deep sense, and that is profound. That is so powerful.
That is well said. And even though there are these are minor but important disappointments. For example, the army general that was let go today, the same person that probably killed the one protester that was shot during the protests. And that, and I know that looking at it long term, it's sort of, there's room for hope, but it's just the fact that there is that kind of ability to take advantage of the pause.
No, it's very painful. Also, if you look at one of the things that's coming clearer is how government and therefore also in this case the whole socioeconomic elite is going to try to get out of the debt crisis, right? Yeah. So we're starting to see how that is, and the proposals that are being worked out with the IMF, right? Because they need $10 or $15 billion from the IMF over the next 5 years minimum, right? Minimum, yeah. And actually, they probably need like 25 billion, but whatever. It's these are all huge numbers. The plan basically is to make the biggest depositors and creditors take a 10% haircut on their deposits. After that, and supposedly protect the ordinary creditors and depositors. But I think it's very clear that once that's done, and beyond protections for modest amounts of bank deposits, really modest amounts of bank deposits, that it's going to be the ordinary people paying the rest of that bill. In other words, that the elite will pay collectively 10% of their big deposits. They won't even notice it, honestly. They won't feel it. It'll be, they'll just take some heartburn medicine and they'll be fine. And then a little down the road, you're going to find out that the lira is devalued hugely, that government spending has to be cut, that this is going to come with austerity programs that are going to be really painful, and the majority of the cost of this is going to be paid by ordinary people. And that's hidden in the way in which it's being presented as a plan that combines the haircut at the very top with external support in order to protect the assets of ordinary people. But what is missing is who pays the extra? They're going to borrow 10 to 15 billion. So who's going to pay? It's not going to be covered by that 10% of who's going to pay? Ordinary people. And one way or another, ordinary people are going to pay it. And this is not a population that can afford to pay the bill that they did not accrue. The ordinary people did not assemble this bill. It's not their bill to pay, but they're going to pay it.
Absolutely.
It's very, very sad. This is outrageous. It's outrageous.
Best of circumstances is a very painful process. And that's a very sad reality. And I think, if anything, this pandemic...
It can help to focus people's attention, remind them, and give them long-term determination that in the future, this kind of Ponzi scheme, pyramid robbery of people is not going to be allowed anymore. The idea that the Banque Liban and the big depositors and the private banks will all collude to, on these ridiculous interest rates for big depositors and even for ordinary, and the whole thing just becomes a way of funneling money up and accumulating ridiculous amounts of debt. And then in the end, the ordinary people end up paying at least half of it, and they benefited virtually not at all. This is not acceptable.
And I don't know if it's being picked up by my microphone, but New York has been sounding like this for a long time.
Picked up. I know. Well, DC is getting more and more. So yeah, of course, that's the other thing, is that Lebanon is going to, in all likelihood, I mean, heaven forbid, but in all likelihood, all countries are going to be hit with coronavirus. Social distancing, I mean, large parts of Lebanon are very densely populated.
Yeah.
Social distancing is going to be very difficult in like Ras Beirut and Ain Raisi and these kind of places, where, and let alone the kind of slum areas. Palestinian refugee camps, for example, or in the parts of the south. Forget it. There's no social distancing by foot, and there's no way that the country is ready for this. It's not as badly off as Venezuela, but it could hit Lebanon really hard unless a treatment is found. I mean, I think the only real hope for the population, especially the vulnerable population of the world, is that sooner rather than later an effective treatment is, because vaccine's going to take a long time. It's going to take a year, but a treatment might be found in months. And obviously testing all kinds of things, including Trump's, pet hydrochloroquine and, whatever his friends sell or whatever it is. I mean, maybe, it's a Hail Mary, but at some point, I think a treatment might well be. And at that point, there's some, especially if it's cheap to produce, then you might escape it. But if not, it's going to be very, very, very bad. And by the way, I don't know if you know about this, but there's a real problem in the Saudi royal family right now. There's 150 Saudi royals are infected, including some very senior people, and it's kind of out of control. It's not in the general population, but so like this has come to the Middle East. Iran is very heavily hit now. Not all of Saudi Arabia, but the parts of the royal family are slammed. 150 infected. It's just out. It's a very big number because there are a few thousand of these guys, and 150 of them. It's a big number. And basically once it starts circulating, it's very infectious. Exceptional infectious thing with a very long incubation period and lots of asymptomatic or lightly symptomatic people who don't think they have a problem. They're just like breathing on everybody else, and this is very bad. So I think it's really important that. Oh, by the way, another great scam in Lebanon right now, the coronavirus scam is the quarantines, right? So people are being quarantined, right? Now, what happens when they're quarantined? They have to go to pay to stay somewhere. And you know who owns those places? Is the friends and relatives of the ministries and the ministers and the government. And they are making a killing. They're charging prime rates. I mean, this is really outrageous. I'm not joking at all. Like, there are people in Lebanon close to parts of the government and other senior people who are cleaning up on the quarantine thing, charging top dollar for accommodating people who have no choice. I mean, they're required to go to these places, and they can't shop around, and they can't say, well, I'll give you half, or no, and they're going to be truly charged. And it's so cynical. It's so like, how do I squeeze the last, the last piece out of this thing? How do I squeeze the last drop?
But I think this, which is shared across the world right now, that kind of authoritarianism in all its different flavors, I think is that's the biggest byproduct of the moment. And and I think it's very difficult to contain that. I mean, and you're saying the way you just described it right now. I mean, this is a horrible reality in Lebanon, and then there's really no ability to kind of rein that in, and it's this is a very unfortunate.
Here's one thing. I think the long-term impact on the whole world will depend a lot on the effect that the pandemic has on the challenge that parochial nativist nationalism has made to the post-World War II and especially post-Cold War multilateralism, internationalism, economic globalization, whether you like it or not, and all that sort of, integrationist tendency, for all its good and bad, it has much of both, but it has been the dominant thing until this sort of, you can call it populism, you can call it nativism, you can call it fascism, you can call it whatever you want, whatever it is. That stuff is getting a shot of adrenaline right now because everyone's saying, oh, they are bringing it here to us. We need borders, travel bans, da-da-da-da-da. And it could be that it is another huge blow to international cooperation. My feeling is that in the long run, though, it's going to be very hard. That actually this virus, as people soberly understand what is required to defeat it and control it, that both the medical and the economic solutions require cooperation between borders.
Absolutely.
And therefore, with some tweaking and some renegotiating, especially China's role in the WTO. I mean, China is treated as if it were Laos. It's still, it was brought into WTO as a developing country. It's clearly not a normal developing country. It's clear. I mean, as I say, that it gets the same terms as Burkina or Jordan or something is just silly. So there are obviously, and I do think, countries are going to want to, who can afford it, are going to want to stockpile strategic supplies. That they said they would, they didn't. Finland has excellent stockpiles. They didn't opt out of international cooperation and globalization. They just stockpiled some stuff, and so all of that is, they're tweaks. My feeling is that in the end, people are going to realize that borders don't help you, racism doesn't help you, nativism doesn't help you. Saying, well, we won't have it here because they will be over there is just absurd. The new White House press secretary, this lady, has this famous quote that she has from February saying, oh, with President Trump, it's so great, we won't have the virus here. And we won't have terrorism here, as in the bad days of Obama, as if, closed borders, the wall, the will of the dear leader or something can prevent a virus from coming. Nothing can. Only one thing can, which is international cooperation. That can help a lot. Travel bans, honestly, in a limited time, judiciously applied, could buy you some time. But that's all it can do. They're no solution. Whereas international cooperation can, in fact. And by the way, if you do that and buy some time and then squander that time, sit around doing nothing with it and telling everyone it's not a problem, it's not coming here, it's one guy and everything's done. Sure. There was no point in having that ban. Yes, it probably bought you a few weeks, but you didn't use the few weeks.
Well said, well said. And I think all the more important is that even these countries that have sort of promoted borders to a degree, look at what happened to Boris Johnson.
Oh, exactly.
Yeah. He's now in intensive care, and I mean, this is a country
he's a very good example because he laughed off the whole thing. He just said, I'm shaking hands, and shaking hands is good, and da-da-da, and he's in ICU. Yeah. And, it's Trump is the most well-protected person because everyone who goes to see him needs to get the 5-minute Abbott test or 15-minute Abbott. The negatives come in 13 minutes and the positives come in 15 minutes. You can't get in to see Trump without taking that test if you're coming in. And the people who work around him need to get tested weekly. So he's pretty well protected from this. But you need something like that. You need, to make sure that everyone who comes in the door doesn't have it insofar as humanly possible. Well, that's, that can be done for a few individuals, but, obviously it's not even the rich and the powerful.
Sure, that's true. Hussein, I wanted to dance back to an earlier part of this discussion, and it kind of it's what we intended to discuss the last time we spoke for a follow-up episode, and it is probably the one issue that will survive all issues. It'll outride the coronavirus pandemic. It'll outride way beyond Biden and Trump's election later this year. I'm assuming it's still happening. All that stuff. It'll
happen. It'll happen. What it looks like after the Wisconsin debacle, I can't tell you, but there'll be an election.
Yeah.
I mean,
So
you
yeah.
need only Congress could reschedule it, and the House is not going to agree to reschedule it. So
Right.
that's it. So unless there's like a million dead Americans, which seems,
probably won't, hopefully
no,
won't.
I
But
don't think so.
the one issue that I think you're maybe the one expert I would like to sort of gauge your mind on is the Arab-Israeli conflict and the Palestinian cause and all that stuff that was kind of being discussed a bit several months ago, the deal of the century and all that blah, blah, blah. You know, I want to ask you not the generic stuff, not the stuff that's always been that's not important, I think, at the moment.
People watching this have that. They know that.
They know that. I want to ask you about, I think it was last night or maybe early this morning. This Benny Gantz's party, I forget the name now.
Blue and white.
The blue and white, yeah, exactly. And of course, Likud, at least expressing a tacit agreement with Labor's endorsement.
Yeah, they made an agreement. Yeah. It hasn't happened, but yeah,
hasn't happened. But let's just project a bit that
it will probably happen. I think it will happen.
Yeah. And this sort of understanding that an annexation of most settlements is going to become Israeli policy.
Well, there is a problem potentially with that. It will become their policy, but will they try to do it? And the way they do it is the same way they did it with East Jerusalem, which is to not annex it formally, like was done with Golan Heights, where there's an actual law in the Knesset that says we, the state of Israel, annex this territory. That was done with the Golan Heights. Yeah. That was never done with East Jerusalem. What was done with East Jerusalem was the Israeli civil law was extended to the entirety of what Israel defines as municipal Jerusalem, right? Yes. So what the Israelis would do is extend Israeli civil law to all the settlements that they want to take and keep, and to the Jordan Valley and whatever they want. Okay, and that would be the de facto annexation, in all likelihood. So the East Jerusalemization of 30 or 40% of the West Bank, or some number like that. I don't know that Trump would want them to do this in the middle of the coronavirus crisis. I think he kind of wanted to open the door for this, but I think he thinks of it as a second-term project. But the first-term project was to change the American policy, change the American discourse, create the space for annexationism, anti-peace, anti-two-state solution, pro-Greater Israel, which did not exist, before Trump was elected. I mean, some really strange, crazy people, Christian fundamentalists, 2 or 3 senators, Inhofe maybe, and 1 or 2 other crazy people, and pretty much no Jews in Congress, in the House or Senate were believing in this. And I mean, it was a very fringe thing. Now he's shifted the Republican Party, and not too many Democrats, but it remains to be seen whether once they're in power, how far back they would be willing to shift, because it's just hard to. It depends a lot on Israeli politics as well. But I think that goal of changing U.S. policy on Jerusalem, changing U.S. policy on annexation in theory, changing the U.S. relationship with the Palestinians to zero, trying to get everyone to reconceptualize the Palestinian national movement as a bankrupt business to be liquidated at pennies on the dollar, as they do in the real estate industry. I think that was the idea. Yeah. And my sense is that if everything was going really well for Trump right now, maybe he would say, all right, now go ahead and take some of it. My feeling, and it's a feeling, I don't know what this guy thinks. I mean, it's very hard to, it's very hard to know. My sense is his plate is full. That he doesn't need another headache, and it would be a headache because, I mean, like pretty much the most pro-Israel Jewish Democrats in Congress are not in favor of his plan. right? His plan was not like the mainstream Jewish groups, a very interesting split. Of course, Zionist Organization of America loved it. American Jewish Committee welcomed it. AIPAC was, yeah, I mean, they came around to it, but you could see they were very uncomfortable. In some weird way, they were not very happy about it. And they still are like uncomfortable. ADL doesn't like it at all under Jonathan Greenblatt. And so very large amounts of Jewish Americans, including very pro-Israel Jewish Americans, still think a two-state solution is a good idea. And they would want Israel to be able to keep a lot of, things, but they don't think this like unilateral annexation is a good idea.
Yeah.
Okay. So there's a lot of opposition to this as well. And I think there's also Republican internationalists, the Lindsey Grahams of this world, are not convinced either. It's the fundamentalists, the Christian fundamentalists in the Republican Party who love it. They're this real constituency. And the Israelis. My sense is that the coronavirus and the economic collapse that it is inducing is making Trump extremely miserable. Yeah, he gets to pose as a wartime leader. Yeah. He gets to clean and all of this stuff. He gets to, an hour on TV every night talking whatever lies he wants to talk, an unbelievable amount of garbage. Yeah, but at the same time, his whole rationalization for being reelected, which was the economy, is in tatters.
Yes.
And it's going to be very easy to make the case that he bungled this and it's a disaster and he owns it. He's in big trouble. I don't think he needs another big problem. And I think it is more likely that he would say to Netanyahu and Gantz, look, you guys are not in a position to do this. You need a government majority that really wants to, take some very small thing or something like that, maybe Ma'ale Adumi or something, but nothing more than that. And leave it if I get reelected, when I get reelected, because he doesn't contemplate anything else, then we'll look at it again and we'll see what we can do. And maybe at that point, the Palestinians will surrender and we can make an agreement with them at all. So I think it is possible under the circumstances Trump will say, please don't do this. Now, there is the possibility that they will say, that's great, and go ahead and do it anyway. And they could try to call his bluff and just do it. What would he then do? I don't know. So if they want to really, give him the middle finger, they could. And it's also possible I'm misreading him. It's possible that he would say this is great. But I kind of think he may feel that he's done enough for the first term.
I want to take it sort of a slightly different direction. That you have a very, very, very friendly American administration to Israel, very friendly, and
Israeli.
you just sort of laid it out there that this it's very pro, to the point that American Jews in Congress are not comfortable.
Yeah, it's pro-annexationist because its thinking is shaped by either pro-settlement Jewish people like Kushner and Greenblatt and Friedman, or more, but much more by the Christian fundamentalists, by the apocalyptic Pence's friends, John Hagee and all of these weirdos. And because of that, they're less pro-Israel and more pro-annexation. I mean, they want the war, they want the apocalypse, they want the second coming. Yeah.
But I'm curious about the current situation where Israel finds itself very cozy with the White House and the U.S. administration, and something that maybe you could shed light on, and I'm not well versed on this, and maybe you can kind of guide me through this. That at least the last decade, aside from the anecdotal sort of coverage, that there's been a warming up from some Gulf countries.
Yes.
Not in direct relationships, nothing that's sort of out in the open, but there is a cozying up, and you see sort of symbolic gestures here and there.
And real cooperation behind the scenes on certain things, on intelligence and cyber warfare, things like that.
Right.
So I'll describe it to you if you want.
There's one thing I'm curious about, and maybe it's the thing that doesn't add up to me. If you have a very comfortable relationship with certain Gulf countries,
it's not very comfortable.
Sorry, let me. I'll rephrase it. Sorry. an unusual,
very good, very cooperative. It's not very comfortable. It's very cooperative.
absolutely. Yeah, you're right. And that an unusually cooperative environment for the
It's
last.
quite uncomfortable, but it's cooperative.
Well said. Cooperative, uncomfortably cooperative. That's true, actually. Yes.
My normal term for it is friendship is benefits without friendship.
It's actually well said. Yeah. So
that's what you have.
And I'm curious from your side, from the way you've been sort of looking at this issue, why aren't there sort of any demands on the cooperative end for an end to this conflict? Meaning that Israel finds itself now with certain relationships in the Middle East. It has very comfortable ties to America. It is in a position now to end that conflict and kind of sort of normalize itself in the region. What are the stumbling blocks to getting there?
Okay, here's the thing. Now let's start with the Israelis and the Palestinians, right?
Yeah.
The Palestinians have no leverage over the Israelis. There is no way for them to put pressure on them, because the only time the Israelis pay attention to the Palestinians is when Palestinians are using armed force and violence, and then the price for Palestinians is higher than the price for Israel, so it backfires. Yeah. None of the other methods work. Internationalization doesn't work. The boycott doesn't really achieve anything. The European pressure is very limited. The protests and all the Sumud stuff is, it keeps the ball in the air, but it doesn't pressure these. So the Israelis can, whenever they want to pretend the occupation is even going on, they can do it and get away with it, which is amazing. But the power asymmetry is maybe the greatest in any long-term conflict between two national peoples in the modern era. I can't think of anything like it, right? I mean, you've got on the one side a very powerful, small but powerful nuclear-armed state, and then a group of people who've never had so much as a tank among them, and never had a state or anything like that. So it's an incredible power asymmetry. So it's very hard for them to put any pressure. And then the Israeli political leaders are accountable to their own constituents, at least their Jewish constituents. And so it's very hard for them to make concessions to what they feel are concessions. It may not be concessions in the abstract, but they feel it as such. That this is land they hold, they can give it up if and follow through when 20% of the Jewish Israelis are fixated on opposing that, and most of the rest are like generally maybe would think it would be okay, but they're not passionately engaged. So it becomes very difficult to actually fulfill those agreements. And no pressure from the United States meaningfully. That was always the case, but now particularly there's no pressure at all. So on just between them, resolving this through the occupation would require an Israeli leap of enlightened self-interest that is incredibly unusual for a parliamentary system. It's just not going to happen. There has to be pressure. The Jewish Israelis, enough of them really, 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 really want to keep those settlements and much of the West Bank and the Jordan Valley, and there's just no real reason for them to give it up, and so they won't. Now, what about the Gulf countries? All right, the reason they've gotten closer to the Israelis, and we're talking about, there are three in particular that are operative. Bahrain is really a stalking horse for Saudi Arabia. It's not, it's in foreign and defense policy, it defers to Riyadh. So, but there are three that are actively engaged in a major way. I mean, Oman has very good relations with the Israelis, but it's not a major player. Kuwait is interested, but no, there are three that are important. Qatar, which has had the strongest relations with Israel, open relations of any of the Gulf countries. They have actually had an Israeli trade mission operating in Qatar in the 1990s. I mean, that was very close to diplomatic relations. It was a lesser form of, it was diplomatic relations. It wasn't a full embassy, but it was the next best thing. And then the UAE and Saudi Arabia, which have developed, both of them, cooperative ties with Israel in terms of intelligence and certain kinds of military information and cyber technology. Now, the reason that this has happened is that the Israelis and the Saudis and the Emiratis see the biggest threats. They identify the same biggest threats in the same way, especially after the fall of Aleppo. Right? It used to be, with regarding Iran, it used to be the Israelis were fixated on nuclear Iran, and they thought that the militia movements and like what the Americans call malign regional behavior, it was these armed sectarian militias, Hezbollah and the Hashd al-Sha'bi and all these groups, even in a way the Houthis, but not really, but kind of, that was leveraged on the Iranians, on the nuclear issue. And the Gulf countries, the Saudis, the Emiratis, etc., and even the Qataris before the boycott thought, okay, no, it's the militias that are the big problem, and the nuclear issue is leveraged. But when Aleppo fell to the Assad regime, the dust settled, and the Israelis looked across, and they saw a different Hezbollah. And they saw Hezbollah is no longer a Lebanese militia. It's a regional vanguard of a network, including the Hashd al-Sha'bi groups and Kataib Hezbollah and the Badr Corps and the Houthis. And they revised their view of the nature of the Iranian threat to much closer to the Gulf perspective, that the militia groups are an immediate threat, at least as much as nuclear Iran, because it's real and it's immediate and it's a big threat. It's not like a kind of a leverage. It's something they really want to do something about right away. So they see the threat in the same way, and that the same threat, and then post Aleppo the same way, which is really important. And then in addition to that, there's the role of Turkey, because both of them also share the view that Turkey is a rising hegemon, totally different to the Iranian one, Sunni Islamist, but maybe less aggressive, slightly less predatory, maybe not, but much more powerful, potentially much more effective, able to potentially reach a lot more Arabs through, if there's no Arab thing, but there's at least Sunni Islamism that they can play off. And it's, there you've got now Turkey heavily engaged in northern Syria, heavily engaged in Libya, heavily engaged in a lot of, so there's now two non-Arab hegemons throwing their weight around the Arab world. And I think the Israelis also perceive that Turkey as a rising threat. So because of this, they have this thing. Now, what that means is there's a lot of stuff they're willing to do together behind closed doors. But I think the Israelis are hoping to have a kind of an alliance with these countries, but they can't. It's not going to happen because for three reasons, all three of these countries are held back. First of all, well, let me just say the Qataris are kind of out of it to some extent because the boycott put on them made them much more dependent on Turkey and Iran than they were before. Especially Turkey, but also Iran for overflight routes and other things. And they're in no position to play the kind of games they want to with Israel that they used to do, and that they, would otherwise want to do. I think they're not less interested in building ties to the Israelis than the other two, than UAE and Saudi, but they're in no position to do it. So what about UAE and Saudi? Oh, by the way, it is really worth noting that in spite of everything I just said, the high point of Israeli diplomacy and Israeli normalization, actual diplomatic normalization with the Gulf, was in the mid-1990s, not now.
Right.
Why? Because that was the high point of the peace process.
Yes, exactly.
That's why.
Right.
It's not a coincidence that at the height of Oslo is when they hit their high, because these are still real issues for the Gulf rulers. And they're real issues for three reasons. The first reason is the obvious one, in politics. They, if they cozied up to the Israelis without getting anything on the occupation, the left would attack them, the right would attack them, the nationalists would attack them, the religious would attack, and they would be very exposed politically, domestically. It would undermine their credibility. The second reason has to do with values. And I mean, people roll their eyes, and some people are kind of sociopathic and don't care, but you're talking about very large numbers of people ultimately. And when you put all these societies together, decision makers, and they are Arabs, they are Muslims, they do care. If they could push a button and reverse what happened in 1947-48, they would do it. And, it's not the big factor, but it's there. The third reason, and people can dismiss it, but I don't. I think it's a factor. I know it's a factor. The third, and this is the big boy, and this is the one that everybody forgets, is the strategic threat. The strategic threat, I mean that if they did that in an open way, that it's obvious, it's not the political or the values, it's the strategic thing. In other words, what does that do to enhance the relative power of Iran, of Hezbollah, of Al-Qaeda, of Daesh, Turkey, of Qatar, of whoever their enemies are? And that this issue is a megaphone, fully charged batteries lying on the floor of the Arab world, and anyone can pick it up and start shouting into it and win points immediately at their expense. And that they know also strategically that this issue, maybe it's calm now for various reasons, right? Palestinians remember the Second Intifada. They don't want to go through that again. They don't know what to do with it. It's fairly calm. But it's not going to stay calm. They know also it's not going to stay calm. And this issue will be back, and it will be very, very painful. And they know that they will not have a good night's sleep. And the security and peace they want until that occupation issue is dealt with. And there's some kind of agreement between, even an interim agreement between Israel and the Palestinians that is livable. And they need that. And so, as long as the Israelis are not willing to budge on this issue, they are not going to make progress with those countries in the open. No way.
In that whole paradigm, which you really you just really laid it out, the whole structure which is in place at the moment, within that, why isn't there some pressure from the Gulf side?
No.
Because they do see some mutual interests, and you explain them on a strategic level.
Yeah.
Why isn't there some sort of nudging to get the Israelis to at least offer something in return through the Palestinian problem?
There is nudging, but so there is nudging in the sense that they've made it very clear they can't go forward with what the Israelis want, which is a more open alliance with a rapprochement with relations if there isn't anything. So in other words, their nudging is withholding, right? They don't actually have leverage over the Israelis. So the Israelis go forward, right? They say, let's have this. Let's not just have a one guy visiting here and a journalist there. No, let's have a trade mission. The answer is no. And here's the thing. From those countries' point of view, right? Now, to be cynical, because again, I talked about values, but you're still talking about cynical politicians, rulers, governments, and there is a cynical side to this as well. I mean, big time. From a cynical point of view, what they say to the Israelis in a roundabout way, not in a direct way, but in an indirect way, and a message the Israelis have understood is, we got from you what we need already. We're not going to give you anything else. All we want is intelligence cooperation. We don't want your embassy in our country. We don't want an embassy in Tel Aviv or wherever. Screw that. What we want is intelligence. We want, cyber. We want your, technology, especially to do with the internet and that kind of stuff, and some, imaging, that, and we're getting that. So the hell with you guys. Now, if you're willing to come to the table and talk reasonably with Abu Mazen and be reasonable and cut this annexation crap, then maybe we would, But until then, we're not gonna.
So at the end of the day, at the end of the day, the Israelis just don't feel any pressure to end this conflict.
None. And I honestly don't think there's much the Saudis and the Emiratis or the Qataris could do to or the Egyptians or anybody or the Jordanians who want this over for their own narrow, personal, selfish interests, as well as other reasons that I don't think there's much anyone can do to force the Israeli hand. You can be belligerent, right? Iran is quite belligerent, at least with words and to some extent through Hezbollah and others. They're belligerent. It doesn't make the Israelis think twice about annexation. They don't sit around worrying about what Qaeda is going to say, or what's Rouhani or Zarif or Khamenei going to say, or they I think honestly, the big problem here, and the big problem at the heart of Oslo, and the reason Oslo was never going to work, is that it allowed the Israelis to keep entrenching the occupation, deepening it, build more settlements, de facto annexation of more and more territory, and reduce the pressure on the Israelis, reduce get them out of the trap they got into in the first Intifada, and confront them with something they could really, that would traumatize them, but that they actually strengthens their grip, which is the second Intifada.
But I'm glad that you laid it out this way, because I wrongly assumed that certain Gulf countries, the three that in particular that you mentioned, had more leverage, and that they were hesitating. But I didn't see it that way, that they've actually already kind of got what they needed, and now it's in the Israeli court.
I think especially the Saudis and the Emiratis have what they really want from the Israelis. And the Israelis don't have what they want, but they don't need what they're not getting. I mean, they can live with the situation.
Right.
And maybe the really frustrated party here is Qatar, because their instinct is to be more friendly to the Israelis, but there's no way they can do that as long as the boycott is continuing.
Yeah.
But that's a minor frustration. I mean, their problem is really a big one. Like they can live with the boycott perfectly well now, but like in the long run, they can't live with it. So they've got a real problem in the long run. I'm fortunately old enough to remember and I mean, all the hindsight aside, all the critique aside, that moment in 1993, 1994, Arafat and Rabin at the White House, Clinton in the middle, that and I remember watching it. I actually remember watching it with my father, and I could see from his eyes that this is special. Forget everything that happened. Forget all the problems with Oslo. Forget all the critique. The fact that America had a central role then, and at least appearing to try to end that conflict. And you reminded me of something when you said the mid '90s with the warmest relations. And I remember. I mean, suddenly Morocco has relations. Tunisia's talking, and I mean, Clinton arrives to Gaza first, doesn't go to Ben Gurion, goes to Gaza. And that has been missing for so long, and Absolutely.
there's
two problems with
it.
One is you're right to remember, because there is a question of hopefulness, and that's really important, because there's so much despair, and the despair in our era is rooted in reality. It's not, this is not a neurotic symptom. This is true. This is absolutely justified. In fact, if you weren't kind of at least partially despairing, not existential despair, but if you were optimistic, you would be very foolish. You would not be looking clearly at the equation. I said, okay. Now, so that's a loss. On the other hand, I remember that era very well. I was pretty skeptical of Oslo, mainly because I look at it and I see no obstacle to the increase of settlements. And I think that's the original sin. And that's the big problem with it. Also, the fact that the part of the Israeli society that never liked it came to power and held power most of the time after Rabin was killed. And I don't know how far Rabin would have gone, but most of the time it was Netanyahu, and then even with Ehud Barak, they were not. Now, I want to throw out a different memory, which is 2000, the summer of 2000, Camp David, right? The meeting, Ehud Barak, Clinton again, good old Clinton, and Yasser Arafat, who didn't want to be there but was told to come. All right, and they have this summit. And it's a total failure. And, we could talk about that for 10 million years. But I was actually with my dad in London. He was recovering from a stroke, and I went to see him, and I was spending a few weeks with him. And he said to me, I was a political scientist from AUB, and he said to me, well, what do you think is going to happen? I said, well, I think it's going to take a long time. But my guess is that in the end, the Israelis will try to impose by force the kind of offer the Palestinians have refused at this conference, which is a limited state broken up with different things, with lots of Israeli annexations, and a kind of state, minus sort of thing. It's exactly what the Trump proposal is. It's exactly where we're going. 20 years later, and I think the big problem for the Israelis was they couldn't try this as long as the United States remained committed to a two-state solution. And the problem is that the good thing about, or the best thing about Oslo, is that the main document, the Declaration of Principles from 1993, carves out these final status issues, including borders and refugees and settlements and all these other areas, and says these are final status issues and can't be prejudiced, which means annexation is, there's a treaty obligation signed by Israel, signed by the PLO, signed by the United States and by Russia, a treaty obligation not to be annexing things, right? And, you know, as long as the United States cared that it was a signatory to the DOP, it was not going to let Israel start violating that treaty that they were both signatories. Now we have an administration that does not even know what the DOP is. Absolutely. You can't talk about it. They couldn't care less. And so now the fetters on the Israeli right are lifted. So we're back to that situation I was talking about before, where the only thing that holds the Israelis back is some kind of an American concern, which is now no longer strategic or goal-oriented. It's more political. I think Trump might hold them back now, but just because his plate's full, he doesn't want. I doubt he wants to deal with that. But I think he thinks of this as a second-term thing. And potentially whatever enlightened self-interest they can muster, but human beings in large groups, in the millions, do not think in terms of enlightened self-interest. You know, they don't. That's not how human beings operate, right? Human beings are, the collectivities behave a lot more like children. You know, they know what they want and they're going to get it. And, you know, I have a couple of I have a very little kid, and it's really good that he doesn't have a lot of power because everyone would be massacred.
During a pandemic, I'm sure he does have some power.
Well, he had no, but I mean the power of force.
Yeah, of course.
Sense, you know, a 2-year-old doesn't think about, he doesn't understand. He wants something, he's going to get it. He's angry at you, you know, like that. And I think human collectivities tend to, you know, start acting like that, where passions are involved.
You know, that decade from Madrid to Oslo to Camp David, I mean, looking back now, it set the foundation to at least talk about a dignified conclusion to the Palestinian cause, one that does not rob them of their rights, at least that it sort of allows also for the Israelis to get some of what they need in terms of security and all that, but that there's a dignified ending to a very, 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 very difficult chapter to modern Middle East history, and also that the Palestinians deserve it. It's not, there's no question about it. And you know what? 2 decades later,
it couldn't be worse. It really could not be worse. No, I mean, it's tragic.
Yeah.
And I think, but I want to just say one final thing. One of the best scholars of this is Shibli Talhamias, is Sadat Center, and he has always maintained that U.S. relations with the Palestinians, diplomatic relations, political relations, that is to say the relationship between the U.S. government and the PLO, were always primarily a function of the U.S. relationship with Israel. And I think history has vindicated recent events and past events, and I think he's absolutely right on that. It's sort of something that one understands in a kind of unstated way, in a liminal kind of way, but when you hear it in those words and you process the data through that framework, I think you realize that he really nailed it. And that's a fact. So that when the United States, in pursuing a certain kind of relationship it wants to have with Israel, finds the Palestinians and relationship with the Palestinians useful, then there's a big one. Insofar as that's not the case, as now, there's no relationship with the PLO. I mean, there's the U.S. consulate in East Jerusalem is closed, and the PLO mission in Washington is closed, and there's nothing. I mean, they meet to discuss the security issues, but there's no real diplomatic relationship. Why? Because there's no need for it. There's no space for it in the current relationship between the Israeli government and this administration. And it is, it really, I think it makes one, it puts the nature of the U.S. role in a really important context. The only thing I want to say is there are a lot of people who say, well, the U.S. is not the right broker. The U.S. is not an honest broker. Of course, the U.S. is not an honest. I mean, I couldn't have been more clear about that just now. I mean, it's not even a broker at all, but it is a third party. Now, there are many people who have said from the beginning until now, and everyone's the wrong one. But at the same time, it's the only one. It's not like the U.S. is fending off a huge parade of other international actors that want to do this.
Right. That's true.
The only other country that's shown any interest in playing this kind of role is France. And France alone, without the rest of the EU, which has no interest, is not capable. It doesn't have the heft. It doesn't have the power to do it. It can defend itself, but not more than that. Russia is not interested. China is not interested. The UN Secretariat cannot do it without, the blessing of the US, Russia, and China. So, the EU is not interested. The Arab League has a very solid proposal, the Arab Peace Initiative. It's excellent, but again, there's not much they haven't tried to push it that much, and there's not. It'd be hard to know where to begin on that, frankly. So my point is that. For Palestinians, I think the PLO in particular, not so much the PLO, I mean the PLO as the diplomatic arm of the Palestinians, came in for a lot of criticism from people for continuing to deal with the Americans, for continuing to accommodate the Americans, for always wondering what's Bush going to say, what's Clinton going to say, what's Obama going to say, what's Trump going to say for a while. Now they don't follow that, but but the fact was that the Washington held the only hope they had for getting what they wanted. And that was a fact. And I'm not sure it's not true anymore. Now, there's no point in trying to pursue it with Trump. And I don't know a Democrat like Biden, for instance, would do to repair. I think he'd do a lot to repair what Trump has done, but I think he would leave a lot of bad things in. Like nobody's moving the embassy, not even Sanders, back to that's just not happening. Now, what you could do is clarify the statement and make sure that everyone understands that you were referring to West Jerusalem and East Jerusalem remains a final status issue. You could say that. Russia said that, and no one cared because no one really expects Israel to get out of West Jerusalem, and the embassy is in West Jerusalem. So you could put it that way, and at least salvage the final status issues. You could reiterate your commitment to a two-state solution. I don't know if it can save anything. My point is just that I think people who are looking at the Palestinian options can sometimes be very harsh on the PLO for accommodating the Americans. But truly, what option do they? I mean, what are you going to get out of Moscow, Beijing, Brussels, Riyadh, Tehran? Who's going to deliver?
But what you're echoed, but Shibli Telhami's quote, which you echoed it, but
it's brilliant, man.
But even in these years, you have very competent, a very disciplined and smart Palestinian prime minister, Salam Fayyad, he can relate to the Americans, and the Americans can easily communicate ideas to him. Even then, I think what you were saying earlier, it resonates, of course, that it's up to the American relationship with Israel. It's not up to the Palestinians. It's not up to the Gulf countries, which you also kind of added to.
So the Salam story is the saddest of all, because he had the best idea for how to use the PA, not the PLO. That's a whole other thing. The negotiations, national strategy, that's something else, and he didn't really get involved in that. But what do you do with the PA? You've got self-rule in a small chunk of the West Bank, but it's where most of your people live, and it's a lot of cities. What do you do with that? And his answer was, you build your state anyway. What the Zionists did. You create your institutions. You
don't wait for the relationship to change.
You don't wait for anything. You create your nation, your state, in spite of the occupation, in order to end it. It was impeccable. Here's the thing with because one of his biggest problems is to do that you need money, And to get the money and to keep the money, you have to stop people from stealing it. And that really annoys people. And you make the budget transparent, and you make it clean, and you cut down on graft, and you really start annoying the political machinery out there. He's not a member of Fatah. He's not a member of the PLO. All of that. The Israelis never liked him because they saw him as a threat. I mean, they liked him in a way because, they like if he builds a hospital, that's one more thing they don't have to do.
Yeah.
But and certainly the security thing they liked a lot, and they still like it. But they were always nervous about him because they knew he had a very good idea that if he really, went with this, it could greatly strengthen the hand of the actual leaders now, and the PLO. So the big problem is that when the PLO went to the UN twice, once to the Security Council and then once to the General Assembly, failed both times. Each time, especially the second time, what was attacked, the revenge by Israel and unbelievably by the United States, was to attack the budget of the PA, which was the raison d'etre for this guy, not a Fatah member and not a PLO official, to be the prime minister of the PA. And without the money, immediately, all the Fatah cadres and everyone who hated him and Hamas and everyone else just chopped his, political head off. They knocked him out immediately. He had no more raison d'etre to be the prime minister, right? Absolutely. And that killed the whole project. So that in a certain sense, you can't convince me that the Americans and the Israelis were sympathetic to Fayyad because they took him out. Whether that was their intention or not, I do not know. But that was the effect. And they must have known. They're not that stupid. Really, they're not that dumb. If it was a Trump administration, I might say, all right, they're so dumb they don't even know what they're doing. But not the administrations we're talking about here. No.
You're right. Because I wanted to end it on 3 positive points.
Okay, great.
The first is that proof that I enjoy speaking to you is that we kind of agreed on a 30-minute conversation. We're approaching 90 minutes. That's the first indication. Second indication.
30 minutes became 90 minutes. And we could go on. It's been great.
Well, that's the second point, which is you're a fellow Ras Beiruti. You talked about your father at AUB. When we speak again, I hope we dive into that because that's the subject I love to
talk about. That. I was looking at maps of Manara and Ras Beirut and Ain Raisi today, really detailed maps. It was really great. So I'd love to talk about it.
That will be the next episode we do. And the third point, which is something I only found out by accident after 90 minutes of speaking to you, is that you're an Andy Warhol fan. And it's been next to your, and you've got...
The catalog Raisonné and 2 over there,
Those are pricey. So if I ever really branch out into other terrain, we'll talk about Andy Warhol.
Sure.
All right. Thanks for your time during the middle of the pandemic, and I wish you the best during this time.
Let's do it again soon. I really appreciate it.
Look forward to it.
All right. Thank you so much.
Thank you, sir.